The number one rule about stories about pirates and treasure is that it's never the pirates that actually get the treasure, right? Cheers. Welcome back to Mousemas, this being the 9th day of Mousemas, or in this case obviously much later because I had to take a break. And before we move on, that's not because I was too disappointed by Outcast of Redwall, it was just that I visited friends, and being the person that I usually am, I forgot or was too slow to pre-record the next couple of videos, which is why we're back now. And now let's actually talk about The Pearls of Lutra, which is book 9 in publication order. And we'll do the usual thing. I'll tell you quickly what it is about, and then we'll talk about why I think it's actually a really good book. I did enjoy this one much more than I did Outcast of Redwall. So, let's get started, right? Alright, Pearls of Lutra takes place after the events of Matimeo. In which case, we remember that Matimeo has a son named Martin, who becomes the next Abbey warrior, and that's sort of who we are dealing with. Matimeo being obviously long past, this is very much people like, Martin the warrior, Martin the Second the warrior, and people around him. That's sort of the timeline where we are at. So this is currently the furthest into the future of Redwall that we have come. The next couple of books will move us further along that timeline as well. The recent ones being the ones that we talked about before, being much more, set in somewhere between the events of Mossflower and the events of Redwall in that regard. So yeah, that's where we are, and we have a story about the Pearls of Lutra, which are in fact the Tears of all oceans, which were, owned by a group of otters, those being, the whole of Lutra. And they were stolen by pirates, and then stolen by one pirate from all the other pirates, and they've gone missing, which is obviously not good if you are, say, the pirate emperor Ublas Mad Eyes, a Pine Marten, who really needs them for his crown. And that's sort of the main first part, is like pirates searching for those specific pearls. On the other hand, we have Grant Longfletch, the one survivor of Lutra's hold, when everyone else was murdered, who's going on a revenge quest, which is obviously the second part of where this story will go. And the third part is, of course, people in Redwall Abbey having to come to terms with the fact that, for whatever reasons, them pearls ended up in their abbey, which is the third sort of part. And from there on out, we have pirates trying to get to the pearls, we have Redwallers trying to find the pearls, which have been hidden in their abbey, and we have, obviously, then Martin and Grad and some others having to go to Pirate Island to free their abbot, who has been taken captive and as a hostage by some of the pirates. And then, all of this kind of goes where it usually goes, which is, lots of piratey stuff going on, and interesting ending after, evil has been defeated. So that's roughly where we are, and yeah. Let's talk about why I think this one works really well in a lot of ways, and why I think it's, a step back up to form after Outcast, which felt a bit sort of congested in a lot of ways, I think. So let's start. And the first part that I found really interesting about this one that I wanted to talk about is the fact that it is a fairly non-violent one. Yes, there is obviously war. It's usually war between, in this case, between the different pirate factions on San Petra, the island. And there's, of course, a bit of a battle around at Redwall at the beginning, but mostly a large part of this book is, taken up by the treasure quest, which I personally really appreciated, because it does not solve, everything through violence or whatever for once, which, has gotten a bit more repetitive over the recent books. So this one, a lot of treasure seeking. And treasure seeking is one of those things that I really feel works really well with children's books, because you have, riddles that people need to follow, and then you have excitement about where those pearls are, and all of that. I do really enjoy it. It's well done. It's certainly one of the strengths of Brian Jacques coming up with these sort of riddles, and then giving, enough clues for the reader to figure out where this is going, while the characters are slowly figuring it out as well, which, I think is really good for the kind of story that you're telling there, because it keeps reader engagement, especially with younger children. It keeps the engagement high. You can always try to figure out where that next pearl will be in that specific, in that way. And I did really enjoy that part. I think it works well, and it's a shifting the balance in between those different elements of traveling, of having whimsical feasts and so forth on the one hand, and then having action and lots of fighting, shifting that balance a bit more into the riddle solving quest part of things, I did really enjoy. I think that's a very, very helpful, it's a good variety from a lot of like fighting that we had recently. So I'm happy for that, and I think Brian Jacques is really good at those, poem riddle kind of things, and using them to further his plot. So that's one thing that I really, really enjoyed and appreciated. Now let's talk about the next part that I think, it's something that has happened in previous parts of Redwall, of the Redwall series, but I think it's in the Pearls of Lutra where it kind of comes more to the fore, and so let's talk about education. I've mentioned that Brian Jacques has obviously spoken about a lot of, has obviously done some research on all kinds of stuff, getting medieval battles right and all that stuff. But there is a level of educating listeners or readers about those kind of things, which once again I think is really interesting and helpful and a cool part for like what is children's books at the end of the day. For example, we have had this in previous books when boats had to be repaired, and he explains how usually it's the Gozim doing it, how they, take tar and take different fabrics to sort of build something to plug a hole in a boat and stuff like that. He's good on that kind of stuff. And we have a situation where obviously one of the otters uses beeswax to keep his bowstring safe from the wet. And those are, once again, these are things, if you read a lot of historical novels, that's stuff you kind of have come across before, especially the wax and bowstring kind of thing. But it's, it's neat to see these kind of things, including their explanations in a children's book. And it's those kind of nuggets and facts that children can then go and tell everyone that they have not learned this before and so forth. And I think it adds to the several like facets that make Redwall such an interesting and outstanding series of children's books. But there's more like that, right? For example, we have a long part about bees in this one. That is, that we have obviously honeybees that live in hives, but you also have the mason bees that live in walls, and that's definitely something that exists, and those are some of the bee species that are incredibly endangered at the moment. So seeing them mentioned and explained how they live is one of those really cool things that Redwall readers will now can take away from this. And I'm sure there's a lot of adult human beings out there who don't even know about these different like types of bees, because we always go like, well, bees bee, right? So, no, it's not, of course not. But having those elements in there, I think, is really nice. We have the seals, we have the whales showing up for like a short bit here and there. We have a lot of these elements where I think Brian Jacques is moving out to sort of expand the world, but also to teach people more stuff. And as I said, like the boat repairing, there's a situation when they are up in the attic, and Martin explains to the younger animals in the abbey how planks are made for like a wood floor, and how you split them and how you fit them together. That's once again, those are like really interesting bits of education that Brian Jacques manages to slip into his books usually all the time. But as I said, I think in this one it was more integrated, the way that the mason bee thing and the wood boards and everything, how those elements are sort of tied into the riddle. So it's educational in a way that some of the others are, well, not as directly. And I think that's something we've seen before with Brian Jacques finding ways to integrate like his penchant for like songs and poems and turning them into like essential parts of the story, not just have like a break for music as you have in a lot of like children's books, but you have them for the Salamandastron song during obviously the last book during Outcast of Redwall, but you also have say the singing song competition during the Bellmaker, and you have those elements slowly tying that all into something that is more coherent, I guess, in a lot of ways. And I think this is what Brian Jacques manages to do with this book, is adding the educational elements and the really interesting information about stuff, adding that into the book. So that's another thing that I found really, that I appreciated about this one. All right, the next bit that I personally really appreciated or think is noticeable here is that we are getting back to something that obviously has happened before, and especially in the Bellmaker when we talked about Blackguard the Rat, and something that annoyed me a lot about Outcast of Redwall, the whole like question of good and evil and so forth, because Brian Jacques is back to sort of once again blurring those lines, because we have two pirates. We have Greylunk the Weasel, I think he's a weasel, yes. Or a ferret, I'm confusing those, yeah. Greylunk, who he's of course bringing the pearls to Redwall Abbey, and we see him befriending Firmold the Old, which is nice, and we have a squirrel and a weasel becoming friends and talking about, old times and so forth. So we see there is once again, redemption there. And we have Rumska, the stoat, I think it's a stoat, yes, who befriends and saves the abbot on her ship, and then we kind of learn more about her and her being maybe not as bad as she was, and going back to the idea that growing up as a sea rat, or in this case obviously as a pirate among other pirate creatures, does certainly lead you to becoming living a violent life and so forth, and the question of like whether that there is still redemption for you there, and if you can be good at heart and live like a hard life. And I'm glad we are back on that specific level, and I do really appreciate that. Another part that I found really fascinating, well, we move slowly beyond that, I think, slowly over to that idea, is when Firmold is writing about Greylunk and having like a wound, like a head wound, and having, crying and obviously suffering from a wound that is officially healed. It's like, is Brian Jacques starting to talk about fucking PTSD in children's books? And yeah, I guess that's exactly what he's trying to do. It's like talking about that there are some things that Redwallers don't understand because they have never been to war, and Firmold the Ancient does maybe understand somewhat, and it's like there's some darkness and some things that you can't just heal with potions and so forth. So we see that coming in a lot of ways, going deeper there, and showing an appreciation for the fact that maybe some people are just that they are just broken mentally, physically, and so forth through trauma that can't necessarily be healed, and it's hard to understand that if you're not, if you haven't lived through those kind of things, and that's once again one of those situations where I really appreciate Redwall being children's books, then suddenly having like very deep insight and adding these sort of like smaller twists that make it interesting for me as an adult to read, because I'm like, there's a lot of books written for grown-ass people that still manage to not include those kind of things or fuck them up if they do, and that's that's something. Which obviously leads to the next big part, and that is once again grief. I think there are several things happening here. We'll talk about the death part for a moment, and then we'll move on into the friendship part that I think is also important. See, we have, of course, our group of treasure seekers, which are, or the pearl seekers, which are Roro, the recorder, the old one, and then we have a group of 3 friends, those being Tansy, the hedgehog, and Cracklin the squirrel, and Dipkin, I think is her name, the mouse. And then Dipkin just dies out of nowhere, off screen, being murdered by Jack Dawes. And I'm like, holy fucking kid, you just killed like a child, one of the main characters that people are supposed to identify with. And that's rough for a children's book, right? Because it just happens. There's like, no one did anything wrong in that situation. There's no larger, lesson to be learned beyond, sometimes people just die because life's unfair, and that's that. And, I'm still kind of surprised that Jacques goes that far and makes it that dark, but, good for him. I think that adds, once again, like depth or nuance or almost like gravitas to Redwall in a way that, it's pretty impressive, I think, there. And the fact that it, happens in that the church that both Clooney and then later Slagar the Fox both use as like their home base during both Redwall and Matimeo, I think makes it interesting, and burning down that church and leaving that place. I think it kind of goes back to the idea that that places do have certain have like a level of like character to themselves, the same that Salamandastron has like a specific spirit, and the same that Redwall has a specific spirit. That church also seemed to have a specific spirit, even though at some point Gomph the Mouse Thief obviously lived there, but beyond that it's an evil place, and it gets sort of destroyed because you need to destroy the place and not just the people that live there, sort of. because I think it's certainly a level of metaphysics that I personally don't agree with in our world necessarily, but I do appreciate Brian Jacques using this as like one way of giving Redwall a specific kind of character, like as a universe, like how the world works in that specific fictional world. I think universe. Yeah, so that's something I find interesting. But I want to talk about something more here with Dipkin and Cracklin and Tansy. Something interesting is happening here, because Redwall has always had these like 3 generations happening at the same time, right? Sometimes 3 and a bit, like with an older generation, right? So we usually have like our adults doing adult stuff, and then we have our young Redwallers, which are, I guess, sort of what you might call teenagers, probably like equivalent to like human teenagers. Obviously, we're talking animals here, but those usually being like Matthias in the first Redwall book and so forth. And then we have the really young children, like the Dibbons, as Jake usually calls them, which are usually getting into mischief, and that can be really annoying, as it was with I guess it was Rollo, young Rollo, all the way back in, is it Mattimeo? I think it might be Mattimeo, when young Rollo is really annoying. Probably was Mattimeo. And that part, I think, is interesting, because we usually have those 3 sort of like things, plot lines, and the 3 generations usually have to work together in some way or form, and that's a bit of a challenge, I think, writing-wise, because obviously adults do different things than teenagers do, and they do different things than young children, and combining those into something workable, I think, is important, but also very difficult. And I think it works really well this time round. We have Arvin and Diggum and whatever the second mole's name is, something Gerbol, I think. I'm really bad with these names. Anyway, so we have those 3 getting up to all kinds of mischief, but by getting up to mischief, still sometimes managing to get stuff, figured out and so forth. And what I found really interesting is Arvin as sort of the ringleader for the really young ones, being very much incredibly annoying, but in a more believable way, right? He does annoying stuff, like keeping stuff to himself and disagreeing with elders, and that sometimes sets back the plot, right? It costs time, because they need to find him again, they need to do all these things, and what I appreciate about that, and it's something that you see also in, say, the first couple of Tiffany Aching books by Terry Pratchett, is it speaks to the fact that if you are a child and you're reading books for children, you also often have, younger siblings, and growing up with younger siblings, especially if they're, like 4 or 5 years younger, there's a marked age difference between, right? Coming to terms with the fact that they are your siblings, and you have to look out for them, and you have to, live with them and be kind to them and all of that stuff, right? Be a normal human, while also trying to find a way to turn yourself into someone who wants to be seen as more adult than you already are. All of that stuff, growing up is difficult for children. Always has been. And speaking to those sort of like very weird conflicts that you have as a child, coming to terms with your younger siblings and seeing stuff that you did basically reflected in them. Obviously, usually you're too young to realize that what annoys you in your younger siblings is usually the stuff is coming to terms with that you probably were the same way and have hopefully changed somewhat already. So seeing that conflict kind of built up between Tansy and Arvin and so forth in this book, I think works really well, because while Rollo was super annoying in Mattimeo, it's usually already fully adult Redwallers dealing with the young kids, and like putting that conflict now between the young animals and the next generation, like the children and the teenagers, basically, I think is a really interesting and helpful choice, because once again, that's something that it's a kind of question, the kind of moral quandary, or whatever you want to call it, that children reading these books will face, while as in a way. So if we assume that Redwall target audience being like 7 to 12 or slightly above that or slightly below that will probably most likely identify with creatures like the generation of Tansy and Cracklin, or with Matthias in the first book, those kind of people, Mattimeo in Mattimeo, for example, right? So if that's sort of like your main target audience, then speaking to their troubles with younger siblings is, I guess, much more effective than speaking to the trouble that their parents might have with their even younger siblings. I think that's a really clever choice to make. And the final part here is, of course, that I want to look at the sort of like friendship and troubles between that generation, Cracklin, Tamsin, and Tansy, and not so much Dibkin, but in fact Viola the bankroll. Because what is interesting here is Brian Jacques taking on sort of rivalry, conflicts, and so forth between teenage girls in this case, which, once again, really interesting idea, and how they sort of have to come to terms with each other and figure out what to do. And you have Tansy, you have Tansy, Cracklin, and Dibkin being friends, and Viola always being the odd one out. And she's, at the beginning, she's described as, the word he uses, it's prissy, and, always crying. It's an archetype. It's very much an archetype in a lot of these kind of books about there's a level of sexism in there, don't get me wrong, that looking at girls that always, dress very, very cleanly and dress finely and all of that, and cry easily and think they're better than everyone else and are slightly, it's an archetype that you see in children's media, and there is a level of sexism in there. There's a lot of issues in there, and that's sort of like what Viola is. But what we learn immediately is that Tansy and her gang being mean to Viola it's bad, right? It's very bad. She may be annoying to them because they're just differently, look at the world differently or whatever. And that's an interesting approach, especially since it's then Viola who goes on that quest and goes to Sanpera with Martin and gang, and actually does become a very, very capable character in that regard. Probably much more capable than, not more capable than Tansy, but finding her place. And I think that's, once again, the strength of Redwall, right, is that a lot of these stories are about different characters with different ideas of how to live their lives, finding the right place, and Viola going out and having that adventure, decides that, she does it competently, and she's really good at it. She helps, steal the much better boat later on, and all of that stuff, right? She's really good at what she does, but she goes, actually taking care of, sick people and so forth in the sick bay and becoming basically chief doctor of the abbey afterwards is what she wants to do, and where her talents lie the most, right? So that's a really interesting approach. And Tansy slowly discovering her capabilities of understanding stuff and being kind and helpful, and that makes her abbess at the end, right? And Cracklin being more interested in riddles and stuff becomes the next recorder. So we have that whole generational change in here that I find really interesting, and we see each of those characters sort of develop their specific skills that make them the ideal choice for whatever they want to take on afterwards in their story, right? So that's a really, really interesting approach. Yes, we have the whole thing when Dibkin dies, and then everyone is grieving, and the idea, no, we do this now because that's what she wanted, and that's what she would have wanted, and giving up is not exactly a choice, and that's up to a point that's very much standard. But on the other hand, it's also very much, it's a cliche or a trope for a reason. That's continuing someone's legacy is something that a lot of us do to deal with grief, and the way Jacques kind of builds that in, I think, works really well. So that's a lot of the stuff that I wanted to talk about. There's one or two minor things before we're done, and then we can move on to whatever else comes in the future, that being, of course, the Long Patrol. Let's talk about Ublas for a moment. He's an interesting new villain in there. And that's something, we have had a lot of different villains. He's like the Emperor. He's slightly mad, but he also has interesting powers, right? He has the power of hypnosis. He can use his eyes to hypnotize people and make them do all kinds of crazy shit and kill themselves and so forth. And that is interesting. There's a bit of a danger there, he's constantly wearing incredibly fine clothes. At some point, he's painting his claws red. I don't want to say that Brian Jacques is queer coding that character, but there is certainly a tendency towards that. Obviously, he's also wearing turbans, and having that additional element of hypnotism in there gives him. There are levels of exoticism or Orientalism kind of tied into that, right? He has his lizards, his monitor lizards work for him, and his trident rats, and he's a despot in a way that we haven't seen before, because all our main villains before have usually been raiders leading with their hordes and so forth. But he's actually the more like despot with entire kingdom and all of that. So that I think it's an interesting change, but I can see how there are sort of like levels that may not, that I would argue have not necessarily aged well, but they're so, minor that I think it's easy to overlook them and just not notice that it's in there. But the combination of, painting his fingernail, his claws, and being clearly vain and wearing a lot of, fine clothes, and being told what kind of clothes he's wearing and how they sort of are important to him, and having the scene with the snake where he hypnotizes the snake, which is a really cool idea, right? Having the dude hypnotize the snake and not the snake hypnotize him. That's a really cool idea, but it does sort of like border on that. And I think what we can learn from this is that it's very difficult to not come up against certain things that we have hopefully figured out are problematic by now, because we grow up in a culture that has by definition always some things that we will find out in the future are maybe not as good as we thought they were when we were like, when we grow up in that. And that will always sort of like seep in, because it's, once again, it's very effective storytelling. It has been for a long time, and that's something that I found with Emperor Ublas there, in a lot of ways. I didn't, enjoy the whole like thing with the rats not liking the lizards, and the lizards freezing in the cold, all of that stuff. It's really neat. I like that. I also really appreciated Grad's storyline of being that really grim, vengeance-seeking character, the same way we saw that in The Bellmaker, with Martin and with that squirrel whose name I have forgotten at this point. But we see Grad going on one of those revenge quests of her own, but she actually gets a happy end, right? She meets Dimbar. Is it Dimbar? Her true shot, or whatever his name is, the other otter, and they go and they save the place, and then she goes back to Ruddering, to the other safe place for otters to live in peace, because it's a place where no war ever comes. And I'm like, yeah, that's nice. You get what you want. That's good. And then Tansy obviously hands over the pearls back to the sea, because they don't need treasure, they need friendship in Redwall in general. So all is well at the end. I think it's an interesting story. It may not be the best, because it does sort of like have balancing and plotting, I would call it, like, pacing issues here and there, but it does get back to the good bits that I really appreciate about Redwall. So I'm glad I read it. I will be talking about The Long Patrol next, which takes place more or less right after this one. Well, I mean, a couple of years later, seasons later than this, and we'll see what happens with, Abbas Tansy and Recorder Cracklin and Arven, the new warrior of Redwall. We'll also learn about the accidental trans mole Diggum, but that's something we'll talk about when we talk about it later. And until then, I don't know. Thanks and cheers, and I'll see you very soon. Cheers.